Schrödinger's cat paradox, a cat locked in a box is both alive and dead at the same time. How is that possible? This is the thought experiment at the heart of Schrödinger's cat, one of the most famous paradoxes in physics. It challenges how we understand reality, observation, and the strange rules of the quantum world. But don't worry, no cats were harmed in the making of this paradox. It's not about actual feline cruelty. It's about unraveling the mysteries of existence. The story starts in 1935, when Austrian physicist Erwin Schrödinger devised the experiment to highlight what he saw as the bizarre and unsettling implications of quantum mechanics. Quantum mechanics is the branch of physics that deals with the very small, the particles that make up atoms. At this microscopic level, the rules of reality behave very differently from what we experience in our everyday lives. To explain this, let's set the stage for Schrödinger's cat. Imagine a sealed box containing a cat, a radioactive atom, a Geiger counter, and a vial of poison. The setup works like this. If the radioactive atom decays, the Geiger counter detects it, triggering the release of the poison, which kills the cat. If the atom does not decay, the poison is never released, and the cat remains alive. The twist is that according to quantum mechanics, the atom exists in a state of superposition. It has both decayed and not decayed at the same time. And because the atom's state determines the fate of the cat, too, is in a state of superposition, both alive and dead at once. This seems absurd, doesn't it? How can the cat be both alive and dead? Schrödinger's thought experiment wasn't meant to explain quantum mechanics. It was meant to criticize it. He wanted to show how strange and counterintuitive the implications of quantum theory could be when applied to everyday objects. At the heart of the paradox is the idea that in the quantum world, particles don't exist in definite states until they are observed. Before you open the box and check on the cat, it exists in both states simultaneously, alive and dead. The act of observation forces the cat into one state or the other, collapsing the superposition. This idea is known as the Copenhagen interpretation, one of the most widely accepted interpretations of quantum mechanics. It suggests that reality at the quantum level isn't fixed until it's observed. In other words, observation creates reality. But Schrödinger's cat forces us to confront just how strange this idea really is. If observation determines reality, then what counts as an observation? Does it have to be a conscious human observer, or could the Geiger counter itself count as an observation? And if observation creates reality, what does that say about the nature of reality itself? The paradox also raises deep philosophical questions. What does it mean for something to exist in two states at once? In everyday life, things are either one way or the other. A light is on or off, a door is open or closed. But in the quantum world, things can exist in a state of both and rather than either or. This challenges our intuitive understanding of how the world works, forcing us to think in entirely new ways. Schrödinger's cat also highlights the problem of scale in quantum mechanics. At the level of atoms and particles, superposition makes sense, and experiments have shown that it's real. But at the level of cats, people, or planets, things seem to behave differently. This disconnect between the quantum world and the everyday world is one of the biggest unsolved mysteries in physics. How do the strange rules of quantum mechanics give rise to the familiar rules of classical physics? The cat-in-the-box paradox sits at the center of this question. Interestingly, there are other interpretations of quantum mechanics that offer different explanations. For example, the many worlds interpretation suggests that when you open the box, the universe splits into two. In one universe, the cat is alive. In the other, the cat is alive. In the other, the cat is dead. In this view, superposition isn't about the cat being both alive and dead in the same universe. It's about the existence of parallel universes where every possible outcome is realized. Another interpretation, known as quantum decoherence, suggests that superposition is disrupted by interaction with the environment. In this view, the cat isn't truly alive and dead at the same time. It's just that our inability to measure the quantum interactions creates the illusion of superposition. These interpretations show that Schrödinger's cat isn't just a paradox. It's a doorway into some of the most profound questions about reality, time, and existence. Schrödinger's cat also has practical implications. Quantum mechanics isn't just theoretical. It underpins much of modern technology, from semiconductors to quantum computers. Quantum superposition, the very concept behind the cat paradox, is what allows quantum computers to perform calculations far beyond the capabilities of classical machines. Understanding these principles isn't just a philosophical exercise, it's the foundation of technological progress. In the end, Schrödinger's cat is more than just a quirky thought experiment. It's a profound exploration of the mysteries of reality. It challenges us to think beyond our everyday experiences and confront the strange counterintuitive rules of the quantum world. And perhaps its greatest lesson is that reality at its deepest level may be far stranger and more complex than we ever imagined. So the next time you think of Schrödinger's cat, remember, it's not just a paradox. It's a reminder that the universe still has secrets waiting to be uncovered. Ship of Theseus. If you replaced every part of a ship over time, its planks, its sails, its wheel, until none of the original parts remained, would it still be the same ship? This question, known as the Ship of Theseus, is one of the most enduring and puzzling paradoxes of all time. It doesn't just challenge how we think about objects, it forces us to question the very nature of identity itself. What makes something what it is? Is it the material it's made of, the way it's put together, or something more abstract? Imagine a ship docked in a harbor. Over the years, parts of it begin to rot and wear out. First, the crew replaces a few planks, then a mast, then another plank, until eventually every single piece of the ship has been replaced. It still sails the seas, carries its crew, and looks like the same ship. But is it? And if it isn't, when did it stop being the Ship of Theseus? Was it after one plank was replaced? Or 10? Or all of them? Now, let's complicate the question even further. Suppose someone gathers all the old, discarded pieces of the original ship and uses them to reconstruct it elsewhere. Which is now the true Ship of Theseus? The one rebuilt from its original parts? Which is now the true Ship of Theseus? The one rebuilt from its original parts? Or the one that has been continuously maintained and updated? Or are they both, in some strange way, the same ship? This paradox doesn't offer easy answers. It leaves us tangled in questions about what identity truly means. The Ship of Theseus isn't just a thought experiment about ships. It's a metaphor for everything in life that changes over time. Think about yourself. The cells in your body are constantly dying and regenerating. By the time you've lived a few decades, most of the cells you were born with have been replaced. Are you still the same person? If so, what makes you you? Is it your memories, your personality, or something deeper and less tangible? The paradox also forces us to consider the nature of objects around us. If you own an old car and gradually replace every part, is it still the same car? Created with time by room. The Ship of Theseus reveals that our concept of identity is far more fluid than we often realize. It shows that the things we think of as fixed and permanent are actually in a constant state of change. Philosophers have grappled with this question for centuries. Some argue that identity is tied to continuity of function or purpose. For the Ship of Theseus, this would mean that as long as the ship continues to sail and fulfill its role, it remains the same ship, regardless of the materials it's made of. Others suggest that identity is tied to the material itself, that the reconstructed ship made from the original parts is the true Ship of Theseus because it retains the original substance. There is also a third perspective, which challenges the idea that identity is a single, fixed thing at all. This view suggests that the Ship of Theseus isn't one ship or the other, it's both. Identity in this sense isn't a matter of either or, but both and. It evolves and adapts, shaped by context and perception. In a way, the Ship of Theseus forces us to confront the idea that the boundaries we draw around identity, whether for ships, objects, or ourselves, are largely artificial. The paradox also has profound implications for how we think about personal growth and change. As individuals, we are constantly evolving. Our beliefs, values, and experiences shape us over time, often in ways we don't fully recognize. If you look back at who you were 5, 10, or 20 years ago, you might feel like you're a completely different person. But are you? Or are you like the Ship of Theseus, a continuation of the same essence, carried forward through time and transformation? This paradox even extends to how we think about societies, cultures, and traditions. A city may replace its buildings, roads, and infrastructure over centuries, but it still feels like the same place. Languages evolve, losing old words and gaining new ones, yet they remain recognizable. Traditions are passed down and adapted, but they retain a sense of continuity. The Ship of Theseus reminds us that identity is not about holding on to the past. It's about navigating change while preserving a sense of connection to what came before. So how do we resolve the ship of Theseus? The truth is we don't. Like all great paradoxes, it doesn't have a definitive answer. Instead, it challenges us to think about identity in ways that are richer and more nuanced. It shows us that change doesn't erase what was. It builds on it. Whether it's a ship, a car, a city, or a person, identity is not something static or absolute. It's a process, a journey, and a story we tell ourselves. The ship of Theseus teaches us that even as we change, something essential remains. What that something is might differ depending on how we view the world. But the paradox reminds us that identity isn't a simple equation. It's a dance between the old and the new, the past and the future, the parts and the whole. And perhaps that's what makes it so life-changing, because it challenges us not just to understand identity, but to embrace the beauty of change itself. Sorite's paradox: how many grains of sand make a heap? One grain certainly isn't a heap. Two grains aren't either. But what if you keep adding grains, one at a time? At what exact point does the pile of sand become a heap? This question lies at the heart of the Sorite's paradox, a fascinating thought experiment that reveals how seemingly simple ideas can unravel into profound complexity. At first glance, the paradox seems easy to dismiss. After all, you might say a heap is just a general term. It doesn't need to be precise. But the moment you start asking where the line is drawn, things get tricky. If one grain doesn't make a heap and adding one more grain doesn't suddenly transform it into a heap, does that mean no amount of grains can ever form a heap? Not just how we define heaps of sand, but how we deal with vague concepts in general. The Sorite's paradox takes its name from the Greek word soros, meaning heap, and has puzzled philosophers for centuries. It isn't just about sand. It's about how we define anything that lacks clear boundaries. Think about baldness. At what point does a person with thinning hair become bald? Or consider wealth. How many dollars do you need to go from being poor to rich? These questions seem trivial at first, but reveal a deeper truth about the limits of language and reasoning. The paradox exposes a fundamental problem with vague concepts. They resist precise definitions. Words like heap, bald, or rich are useful because they allow us to talk about general ideas without needing exact measurements. But when pushed to their limits, these concepts become ambiguous. The Sorite's paradox forces us to confront this ambiguity and question how we can make sense of a world filled with fuzzy boundaries. Full answers, but full answers. But Sorite's paradox is by introducing the idea of degrees or gradual change. Instead of thinking in absolutes, heap or not a heap, we could think in terms of probabilities or thresholds. For instance, we might say that as the number of grains increases, the likelihood of the pile being considered a heap gradually rises. This approach avoids drawing a hard line but raises another question. How do we decide where to place these thresholds? Even with degrees, the problem of vagueness remains. Another proposed solution is to embrace the idea of context. In some contexts, a pile of 50 grains might be called a heap, while in others, it might not. For example, if you're talking about grains of sand on a beach, a small pile might not qualify as a heap. But if you're looking at grains on a table, even a tiny pile might seem like a heap by comparison. This context-dependent view acknowledges that definitions are flexible, shaped by the situations in which they're used. The Sorite's paradox doesn't just challenge how we think about words. It has real-world implications. Take laws, for example. Many legal systems rely on vague concepts like reasonable doubt or excessive force. These terms are intentionally left flexible to accommodate different situations, but they also create room for interpretation and disagreement. The paradox reminds us that while vagueness can be useful, it can also lead to uncertainty and conflict. Similarly, the Sorite's paradox applies to social and ethical questions. Consider climate change. At what point does a gradual increase in temperature become a crisis? Or think about social issues like inequality. How much disparity is too much? These are not just abstract questions. They influence how we respond to some of the most pressing challenges of our time. The Sorite's paradox forces us to confront the fact that many of these problems don't have clear-cut solutions. But perhaps the most profound lesson of the Sorite's paradox is what it reveals about our need for clarity in a messy, ambiguous world. We like to think in categories, dividing things into neat boxes. This is a heap. This isn't. This is bald. This isn't. But the world rarely conforms to such clear distinctions. The Sorite's paradox challenges us to embrace complexity and uncertainty, recognizing that many of the concepts we use are imprecise by nature. In the end, the Saharites paradox isn't just about grains of sand or fuzzy definitions. It's a reminder of how we navigate the gray areas of life. It teaches us that ambiguity is not a flaw in our thinking, but a reflection of the world's complexity. And perhaps that's what makes this paradox so life-changing. It shows us that the search for clarity often leads not to answers, but to deeper questions, pushing us to think critically about the words we use, the decisions we make, and the way we understand the world. Stability and stability paradox. Imagine a world where the more secure you try to make things, the more dangerous they become. It sounds counterintuitive, doesn't it? But this is the essence of the stability and stability paradox, a concept rooted in political science and international relations that reveals how attempts to maintain peace and stability can, paradoxically, increase the likelihood of conflict. It's a fascinating and unsettling idea that challenges our understanding of security and the delicate balance of power. The stability and stability paradox emerged during the Cold War, a period defined by the tension between two nuclear superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union. Both nations possessed enough nuclear weapons to destroy each other and the world many times over. Nuclear weapons to destroy each other and the world many times over. This concept of mutually assured destruction created what seemed like an ironic form of peace. After all, no rational actor would start a nuclear war knowing it would result in total annihilation. But here's where the paradox comes in. While the threat of nuclear war stabilized relations at the global level, it made smaller, localized conflicts more likely. Why? Because when two major powers know that full-scale war is off the table, they might feel emboldened to engage in smaller, indirect confrontations. During the Cold War, this played out in the form of proxy wars, conflicts in Vietnam, Korea, and Afghanistan where the superpowers supported opposing sides without directly confronting each other. The very stability created by the nuclear stalemate paradoxically made these smaller wars more likely. At its core, the stability and stability paradox is about incentives. When stability is maintained at the highest level, through a balance of power, deterrence, or fear of escalation, it can create a sense of security that lowers the perceived risks of smaller-scale conflicts. Actors may feel they can engage in limited aggression without triggering a catastrophic response. In this way, the paradox shows how efforts to maintain peace can unintentionally create opportunities for violence. But the paradox isn't confined to the Cold War. It has profound implications for modern geopolitics. Consider the current era of nuclear-armed states. While the doctrine of mutually assured destruction still acts as a deterrent against full-scale war, the same dynamic plays out in regional conflicts. For example, tensions between nuclear-armed neighbors like India and Pakistan have occasionally flared into skirmishes and border disputes, even as the threat of nuclear escalation looms in the background. The paradox reminds us that stability at one level can create instability at another. The stability and stability paradox also applies to areas beyond warfare. Take cybersecurity, for example. As nations and organizations build increasingly secure digital systems, they inadvertently escalate the arms race with hackers and cybercriminals. The more robust the defenses, the more sophisticated the attacks become, leading to a cycle of stability at the systemic level and instability at the tactical level. Similarly, in economics, efforts to stabilize markets through regulation can sometimes create conditions for localized bubbles or crises as actors exploit perceived safety nets. The paradox raises difficult questions about the nature of security and power. How do we balance efforts to maintain stability with the unintended consequences of those efforts? Is it possible to create a system that is both secure and flexible without encouraging the kind of instability the paradox describes? These questions have no easy answers, but they highlight the importance of thinking critically about the ripple effects of our actions. One of the most profound lessons of the stability and stability paradox is the importance of humility in decision-making. It reminds us that systems, whether they're geopolitical alliances, technological networks, or economic markets, are complex and interconnected. Actions intended to solve one problem often create new ones, and the consequences of those actions can be difficult to predict. The paradox challenges us to think beyond short-term goals and consider the broader dynamics at play. It also underscores the need for communication and trust. In the context of international relations, transparency and dialogue can help mitigate the risks of miscalculation. When actors understand each other's intentions and capabilities, they're less likely to stumble into conflicts that could spiral out of control. The stability-instability paradox shows us the dangers of assuming that stability is self-sustaining. It requires constant effort, cooperation, and vigilance. But perhaps the most unsettling aspect of the paradox is its persistence. As long as there are imbalances of power or competing interests, the dynamics it describes will continue to shape our world. There are imbalances of power or competing interests. The dynamics it describes will continue to shape our world. The paradox forces us to confront the uncomfortable reality that peace is fragile and often paradoxical in nature. It's not simply the absence of conflict. It's a delicate equilibrium that can tip into instability when pushed too far. So what can we learn from the stability-instability paradox? First, it teaches us to question the assumption that stability is always a good thing. While stability can reduce the likelihood of large-scale conflict, it can also create conditions for smaller-scale aggression. Second, it challenges us to think critically about the unintended consequences of our actions, particularly in complex systems. And finally, it reminds us that true security requires more than deterrence. It requires understanding, adaptability, and a willingness to engage with uncertainty. In the end, the stability-instability paradox isn't just a concept from international relations. Instability paradox isn't just a concept from international relations. It's a lens for understanding the complexities of human behavior, systems, and relationships. It challenges us to navigate the fine line between peace and conflict, stability and chaos, and to recognize that the answers to these challenges are rarely simple. And perhaps that's the paradox's greatest lesson, that the pursuit of stability is itself a dynamic, ever-evolving process, one that requires constant reflection, humility, and care. Sword and shield. Paradox. Imagine a merchant boasting about his incredible weapons. This sword, he says, is so sharp it can cut through anything. Then he picks up a shield and declares, and this shield is so strong it can block any attack. A curious onlooker raises a hand and asks, "What happens if your sword strikes your shield?" The merchant freezes, realizing the contradiction. This is the sword and shield paradox, also known as the paradox of the irresistible force and the immovable object. It's a thought experiment that seems simple but reveals profound truths about logic, language, and the limits of absolute claims. The paradox originates from ancient China, where a merchant's exaggerated claims about his unbeatable sword and unbreakable shield were met with the same question. What happens when they meet? The paradox highlights an inherent contradiction. Both claims can't be true at the same time. If the sword can cut through anything, it must pierce the shield. But if the shield can block anything, it must stop the sword. The two absolute qualities cancel each other out. It must stop the sword. The two absolute qualities cancel each other out, creating an impossible situation. On the surface, this seems like a clever puzzle, but it's more than that. The sword and shield paradox forces us to confront the limitations of absolutes. Absolute claims like "this sword can cut through anything" or "this shield can block anything" are appealing because they sound definitive and powerful. But when two absolutes collide, they expose the flaws in their logic. The paradox reminds us that the world is rarely as black and white as absolute statements make it seem. One of the most interesting aspects of the sword and shield paradox is how it applies to real-world situations. Think about debates or arguments where two opposing ideas claim to be entirely correct. For example, what happens when the need for absolute security collides with the demand for absolute freedom? Both ideals sound appealing on their own, but when pushed to their extremes, they can't coexist. The paradox shows us the value of nuance and compromise, reminding us that absolutes are often unrealistic in a complex world. The paradox also has implications for logic and reasoning. It exposes the limits of systems that rely on contradictions. In formal logic, statements that contradict themselves are considered invalid or nonsensical. The sword and shield paradox illustrates this by creating a scenario where language breaks down. If a sword can cut through anything and a shield can block anything, the words anything lose their meaning when applied together. The paradox challenges us to think critically about the assumptions and definitions we use in reasoning. Philosophically, the paradox raises questions about the nature of power and limits. What does it mean for something to be truly unstoppable or immovable in physics? For example, the idea of an irresistible force meeting an immovable object is often used as a metaphor for conflicting principles. But in reality, The concept doesn't make sense within the laws of the universe. If such a force and object existed, one would cancel out the other, showing that even in theory, absolutes have boundaries. The sword and shield paradox also has a psychological dimension. It reflects the human tendency to make exaggerated claims or seek certainty in an uncertain world. Whether it's advertising, politics, or personal beliefs, we often encounter statements that promise absolutes. The paradox teaches us to approach these claims with skepticism, recognizing that the truth is often more complex than it appears. Interestingly, the paradox is closely related to other famous thought experiments, like the liar's paradox, where a statement contradicts itself. This sentence is false. Both paradoxes reveal how language and logic can create situations that defy resolution. They challenge us to question the way we think and communicate, showing that even the most straightforward ideas can lead to profound puzzles. So what's the solution to the sword and shield paradox? The short answer is that there isn't one, not within the framework of the paradox itself. The contradiction is built into the scenario, making it impossible to resolve without abandoning one of the claim. This lack of resolution is what makes the paradox so powerful. It forces us to confront the limitations of our understanding and embrace the complexity of the world. The sword and shield paradox isn't just a quirky puzzle, it's a tool for critical thinking. It reminds us to question absolutes, seek nuance, and recognize the limits of logic and language. In a world that often values certainty and simplicity, the paradox encourages us to embrace ambiguity and complexity, showing that the most interesting questions are often the ones without clear answers. In the end, the sword and shield paradox isn't about weapons or warriors. It's about the collision of ideas, the nature of contradiction, and the search for truth. It challenges us to think beyond the surface, to question what we take for granted, and to see the world not in absolutes but in possibilities. And perhaps that's the greatest lesson of all, that true understanding comes not from resolving paradoxes, but from learning to live with them. Tolerance paradox. Can a tolerant society remain tolerant if it tolerates intolerance? This is the tolerance paradox, a profound and troubling dilemma first introduced by philosopher Karl Popper. It challenges the very foundation of what it means to live in an open, free society. At its core is a simple yet uncomfortable question. How far should we go in accepting opposing viewpoints, especially when those viewpoints threaten the very fabric of tolerance itself? Let's imagine a society built on the principle of tolerance. People are free to express their beliefs, live how they want, and engage in open dialogue. But then an intolerant ideology begins to emerge, one that rejects the values of tolerance and actively works to suppress others' freedoms. What should the tolerant society do? If it tolerates the intolerant, it risks being overrun by those who reject tolerance altogether. But if it doesn't tolerate the intolerant, hasn't it abandoned its own principle of tolerance? This is the heart of the paradox. Tolerance is often seen as an absolute good, but the tolerance paradox reveals its limits. It forces us to confront the uncomfortable truth that tolerance, when taken to an extreme, can become self-destructive. Popper introduced this idea in his 1945 book, The Open Society and Its Enemies. He argued that unlimited tolerance leads to the erosion of tolerance itself. If a society allows intolerant ideologies to take root and spread unchecked, those ideologies can eventually undermine the freedoms that made the society tolerant in the first place. Popper's solution was clear but controversial. A tolerant society must reserve the right to be intolerant toward intolerance. On the surface, this might sound contradictory. After all, how can a society committed to tolerance justify being intolerant? But Popper's argument isn't about suppressing disagreement or silencing opposing viewpoints. It's about drawing a line when those viewpoints actively threaten the rights and safety of others. The goal isn't to eliminate conflict or disagreement, but to protect the very conditions that make a tolerant society possible. The tolerance paradox isn't just a philosophical puzzle. It has real-world implications. Consider freedom of speech, one of the cornerstones of a tolerant society. Should this freedom extend to those who use it to spread hate speech, incite violence, or advocate for the suppression of others' freedoms? Some argue that even the most offensive ideas should be allowed in the name of free expression, trusting that open debate will expose and discredit harmful views. Others contend that allowing such speech can create an environment where intolerance thrives, ultimately putting vulnerable groups at risk. History offers plenty of examples where the tolerance paradox has played out in dramatic ways. In the early 20th century, many democratic nations tolerated the rise of authoritarian movements, believing they could coexist with democratic values. But in cases like Nazi Germany, that tolerance allowed intolerant ideologies to gain power and dismantle democracy from within. These historical lessons show that unchecked tolerance can have devastating consequences. But where should we draw the line? This is where the tolerance paradox becomes especially tricky. Not all forms of intolerance are equally dangerous, and not all disagreements threaten the fabric of society. Disagreeing with someone's political views or cultural practices isn't the same as advocating for their suppression. The challenge lies in distinguishing between harmful intolerance that needs to be addressed and healthy conflict that should be encouraged. Critics of Popper's idea often raise concerns about who gets to decide what counts as intolerant. They argue that labeling certain ideas or groups as intolerant can be subjective and prone to abuse. A government or group in power could misuse this principle to silence dissent under the guise of protecting tolerance. This highlights the delicate balance a society must strike between protecting itself and avoiding authoritarianism. The tolerance paradox also raises important questions about human psychology and group dynamics. Intolerance often arises from fear, ignorance, or a sense of threat. Addressing these underlying causes through education, dialogue, and empathy can be more effective than simply suppressing intolerant ideas. But even these approaches have limits, especially when dealing with ideologies that are fundamentally opposed to dialogue or compromise. In today's polarized world, the tolerance paradox feels more relevant than ever. We see debates over free speech, censorship, and the boundaries of tolerance play out daily, from social media platforms to political arenas. As we navigate these challenges, the paradox reminds us that tolerance isn't just about accepting differences. It's about actively protecting the principles that make coexistence possible. So, what can we learn from the tolerance paradox? First, it teaches us that tolerance has limits, and those limits are necessary to preserve the values we hold dear. Second, it challenges us to think critically about how we respond to intolerance, whether through open dialogue, legal protections, or, in extreme cases, restrictions. And finally, it reminds us that a tolerant society is not a passive one. It requires vigilance, courage, and a willingness to confront difficult questions about freedom, fairness, and justice. The tolerance paradox isn't just a problem to be solved, it's a reflection of the complexities of living in a diverse and open society. It forces us to grapple with the tension between our ideals and the realities of human behavior. And perhaps its greatest lesson is that tolerance isn't a static principle, it's a dynamic, one that requires constant effort to uphold. And the paradox doesn't weaken the idea of tolerance. It strengthens it by showing us that true tolerance is not about accepting everything, but about standing firm in defense of what matters most. Unexpected hanging paradox. A prisoner is sentenced to be hanged, but with an unusual twist. The judge announces, "You will be hanged at noon on one weekday next week, but it will be a surprise. You won't know the day of your execution until the executioner arrives." The prisoner, desperate to avoid the noose, thinks carefully and begins to analyze the situation. If the execution happens on Friday, he reasons, it won't be a surprise, because if he's still alive by Thursday evening, Friday is the only day left, so Friday is ruled out. Then if Friday is ruled out, Thursday can't be the day either. After all, if he's alive by Wednesday night, Thursday would also be predictable. Using this same logic, the prisoner eliminates Wednesday, Tuesday, and even Monday. He concludes that the judge's statement is impossible and he'll never be hanged. Feeling relieved, the prisoner goes to bed, confident in his reasoning. But on Wednesday at noon, the executioner arrives and the prisoner is hanged completely by surprise. How is this possible? This is the unexpected hanging paradox, a thought experiment that has baffled philosophers, mathematicians, and logicians for decades. It's a paradox that plays with our understanding of logic, knowledge, and self-fulfilling reasoning. At first glance, the prisoner's reasoning seems airtight. By eliminating each day as a possibility, he concludes that the judge's statement contradicts itself. But this paradox reveals a deeper flaw in how we think about knowledge and surprise. The key lies in the prisoner's assumption that he can predict the execution by ruling out days. While his logic is internally consistent, it fails to account for the very nature of surprise. Let's break it down. The judge's promise has two parts. First, the prisoner will be hanged next week. Second, the hanging will come as a surprise. The prisoner's mistake is in treating these two conditions as if they are entirely separate. By trying to outsmart the judge, the prisoner convinces himself that the hanging can't happen at all. But this very conclusion ensures that when the execution does occur on a day he ruled out, it will indeed be a surprise, fulfilling the judge's promise. The unexpected hanging paradox challenges our understanding of logical reasoning and prediction. It highlights the limits of deductive reasoning, especially when applied to situations involving surprise or uncertainty. The prisoner's logic works only if he assumes that his deductions can't be wrong, but the paradox exposes how his own reasoning creates the conditions for the judge's statement to hold true. This paradox has fascinated logicians because it raises profound questions about the nature of self-referential statements and the relationship between knowledge and uncertainty. It's similar to other paradoxes, like the liar paradox, where a statement like, "this sentence is false," creates a loop of contradiction. In the unexpected hanging paradox, the prisoner's reasoning becomes self-referential. He uses his predictions to try to avoid the surprise, but those very predictions ensure the surprise happened. Philosophers have debated the deeper implications of this paradox for decades. One interpretation is that it reveals the limits of human reasoning. Our logical systems rely on clear rules and assumptions, but the unexpected hanging paradox shows that even the most rigorous reasoning can break down when it encounters uncertainty or self-reference. It forces us to confront the possibility that some aspects of reality might be fundamentally unpredictable. The paradox also has connections to game theory and decision-making. In game theory, players often try to anticipate their opponent's moves, but the unexpected hanging paradox shows how overthinking and second-guessing can backfire. By trying to predict the execution, the prisoner inadvertently ensures its success. This has parallels in real life, where attempts to outsmart systems or predict outcomes can lead to unintended consequences. But the paradox isn't just a puzzle for philosophers. It has practical implications for how we think about surprise, uncertainty, and planning. It reminds us that not everything can be predicted or controlled, no matter how much we analyze or prepare. In a world filled with uncertainty, the unexpected hanging paradox teaches us to embrace the unexpected and recognize the limits of our knowledge. What's particularly striking about this paradox is its ability to create tension between logic and intuition. On the surface, the prisoner's reasoning feels flawless. Yet the moment the execution happens, we realize the flaw in his thinking. This tension between expectation and reality is what makes the paradox so compelling and so deeply unsettling. The unexpected hanging paradox forces us to confront one of life's greatest mysteries, the nature of the unknown. It challenges us to think critically about how we approach uncertainty and reminds us that even the most carefully constructed plans can be upended by the unexpected. And perhaps that's the paradox's greatest lesson, that sometimes the only certainty is surprise itself. Value paradox: why is water, which is essential for life, so cheap, while diamonds, which have no real survival value, are so expensive? This is the value paradox, also known as the diamond-water paradox, and it challenges how we think about worth, utility, and the things we value in life. First articulated by Adam Smith, the father of modern economics, this paradox has puzzled thinkers for centuries, revealing surprising truths about human decision-making and the nature of value. To understand the value paradox, let's start with the basics. Water is vital. We need it to drink, to grow food, to clean, to survive. Without water, life as we know it would end. Diamonds, on the other hand, are essentially luxury items. They're used for adornment, industrial tools, and symbolic gestures like engagement rings. But you could live your entire life without ever needing a diamond. So why is it that water, which is essential, is often free or costs very little, while diamonds, which are non-essential, are staggeringly expensive? The paradox lies in the difference between two types of value: utility and exchange value. Utility refers to the usefulness of something, its ability to satisfy a need or want. Water has enormous utility because it's indispensable for life. Exchange value, on the other hand, refers to what something can be traded for in a market, and this is where the paradox emerges. Water has high utility but low exchange value, while diamonds have low utility but high exchange value. The resolution to this paradox lies in a concept called marginal utility, which explains how value is influenced by scarcity and context. Marginal utility is the additional satisfaction or benefit you get from consuming one more unit of something. Think of it this way. If you're stranded in the desert, dying of thirst, a glass of water would be priceless. It could save your life. But if you're at home with unlimited access to clean water, an extra glass has little value because your basic needs are already met. The value of water depends not just on its overall importance, but on how much of it you already have. Diamonds, in contrast, are rare. Their scarcity means that each individual diamond has a high marginal utility. Because they're not easily available, people are willing to pay a premium for them, even though they don't have the life-saving utility of water. The value paradox shows us that value isn't just about necessity. It's about context, availability, and perception. This paradox has profound implications for economics and human behavior. It reveals how markets operate, not on absolute value, but on relative value. People don't pay for how important something is in an abstract sense. They pay for how much it's worth to them in the moment, given their needs and circumstances. This is why luxury goods, which are scarce and desirable, command high prices, even if they have little practical use. The value paradox also challenges us to think critically about the things we prioritize, and pursue it reminds us that value is often subjective, shaped by culture, society, and individual preferences. What one person sees as valuable, another might see as unnecessary. Diamonds, for example, are prized in many cultures as symbols of love, status, and wealth, but their value is largely a social construct. Water, on the other hand, is often taken for granted because of its abundance, even though it's the foundation of life itself. In modern economics, the value paradox has been resolved through the theories of supply and demand. Water is cheap because it's abundant and easy to access in most parts of the world. Diamonds are expensive because they're scarce and difficult to mine, refine, and bring to market. The interplay between supply, demand, and marginal utility creates the price differences we observe. But this resolution doesn't diminish the paradox, it deepens it. It forces us to recognize how easily scarcity and perception can distort our understanding of worth. The value paradox also holds lessons for how we think about the broader economy and global issues. Consider water again. While it may be inexpensive in places with abundant access, in drought-stricken regions or areas with poor infrastructure, clean water can become a highly valuable and even unaffordable resource. The paradox reminds us of the fragility of abundance and the importance of managing resources wisely. On a more philosophical level, the value paradox invites us to reflect on the things we truly value in life. Do we prize the essential, but often invisible resources like water, air, and community? Or do we chase the rare and glamorous like diamonds and status symbols at the expense of what really sustains us? It's a question that goes beyond economics, touching on our priorities as individuals and societies. Ultimately, the value paradox is more than a quirky economic puzzle. It's a lens through which we can explore the complexity of human choices, the intricacies of markets, and the values that shape our world. It teaches us that value is never absolute. It's always contextual, dynamic, and deeply tied to how we see ourselves and our place in the world. And perhaps that's the paradox's greatest lesson, that what we value says as much about us as it does about the things we value.